He spent 6 years treating her like furniture. It took him 6 hours after the divorce to understand she was the most dangerous person he had ever known. For 6 years, Graham Holloway used his wife as a decorative accessory, elegant at charity dinners, invisible everywhere else. He never asked where she came from, never wondered why she flinched at certain names or went quiet when helicopters passed overhead. He assumed she was grateful. He assumed she was nothing. He was wrong about everything. If you're watching this right now, stay until the end, because this story doesn't go where you think it goes. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The morning of the divorce, Graham Holloway wore his best suit. Not because he was nervous, not because he thought it would matter. He wore it because he liked the way it made him feel. Clean, composed, untouchable. And because some part of him wanted Seraphine to see exactly what she was walking away from. $1,200 of Italian wool. A man who had built 3 companies before 40 and never once apologized for the size of his ambition. A man who, by any reasonable measurement, had won. The courthouse hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Graham stood near the window, watching gray clouds pile up over the city, and when his attorney touched his elbow to signal it was time, he followed without looking back. Seraphine was already in the courtroom. She sat on the far side of the room with a single attorney and no one else. No friends, no family. No one who'd driven 3 hours to hold her hand or squeeze her shoulder. She wore a dark coat, charcoal gray, buttoned to the collar, and her hands rested flat on the table in front of her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't staring at him with wounded eyes or performing the kind of quiet devastation he'd half expected. She was simply present, composed in a way that Graham found vaguely irritating, the way stillness in other people sometimes irritated him when he couldn't find a crack in it. 6 years of marriage. He hadn't touched her in 2 of them. The proceedings took 40 minutes. Graham's attorney spoke at length about the prenuptial agreement, the separation of assets, the clean and unambiguous terms they'd both agreed to before the judge had even settled into his chair. Seraphine's attorney said very little. She signed where she was asked to sign. She didn't contest a single clause. When it was over, she gathered her folder and stood, and Graham watched her move toward the door with the kind of fluid economy that had always puzzled him, as if she never needed more space than she was given, as if she'd long ago learned to exist within whatever walls surrounded her. He almost said something. He didn't know what. Something that would have sounded like closure but felt like an exit wound, the kind of thing divorced men say when they want to believe the decision costs them nothing. But she was already through the door, and his attorney was shaking his hand, and the clouds outside the window had opened up into rain, and Graham told himself it was cleaner this way. He was still telling himself that 3 hours later when his phone started ringing. The first call was from Marcus, his head of investor relations. Graham took it in the back of the car, half listening, watching the rain streak sideways across the window. Marcus was talking fast, the way he talked when he was trying not to sound as scared as he was. Words like account suspension and regulatory hold, and we need you in the office now, were landing around Graham like stones. And he sat up slowly and made Marcus repeat himself twice before he believed what he was hearing. 4 of his primary operating accounts had been frozen simultaneously. Not 1, not 2, 4. And the holding entity behind his largest development project, a $500 million coastal resort that had taken 3 years to finance, had filed for dissolution that morning without warning, without explanation, without so much as a courtesy call. Marcus, Graham said, I know. That filing should have required 30 days written notice minimum. I know, Graham. So who authorized it? Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that meant his head of investor relations had already spent the last 90 minutes asking exactly that question and had come up empty. Graham was in the office within the hour. The building felt different when he walked through it. People moving with their eyes down, conversations dropping to murmurs when he passed. His assistant handed him a stack of printed documents the moment he stepped off the elevator and told him there were 7 calls waiting and that 2 men from the Federal Financial Crimes Division had been in the lobby that morning and were expected to return. Graham took the documents. He went into his office and closed the door. He sat with the papers for 20 minutes before he could make himself read them clearly. The accounts weren't frozen by a bank. They were frozen by an enforcement action tied to a series of international wire transfers. Transfers he had never authorized, bearing his digital signature. Someone had accessed his financial infrastructure at a level that required intimate knowledge of his internal systems, his authentication protocols, his chain of command. Someone who had been inside his world long enough to understand exactly how to dismantle it from the inside out. He called his attorney, then his head of security, then the private firm he retained for sensitive situations, the one with the gray logo business card and the number that rang twice before a person picked up. He made all 3 calls in under 15 minutes, his voice controlled, his jaw tight, and when he'd finished, he stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the rain-soaked city beneath him. He thought about the morning, the courtroom, the charcoal coat. He pushed the thought aside. There was no connection. There couldn't be. Seraphine Vale had arrived in his life with a single suitcase, a recommendation from a mutual acquaintance he barely remembered, and a polite, unremarkable background that his team had vetted before the engagement. She'd grown up quiet, studied abroad, worked briefly in private art acquisition before they married. Her family, whatever remained of it, was scattered and uncontactable. Estranged, she'd always said, in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. She had no business interests, no financial holdings, no network worth naming. She was the kind of woman whose footprint was so light it almost wasn't there at all. He told himself that was a virtue once. Now it made his stomach move in a way he didn't want to examine. Outside the city, past the ring roads and the freight corridors and the long industrial stretches that bled eventually into pine forest and mountain rock, there was a road that didn't appear on standard maps. It branched off a regional highway 60 miles past the last visible settlement and climbed through switchbacks and dense tree cover for another 40 minutes before it reached a valley most people had no reason to know existed. At the end of that road, set into the mountain like it had grown there, was an estate built from dark stone and iron and 2 centuries of deliberate secrecy. Seraphine arrived at the outer gate just before 2 in the afternoon. She'd changed on the plane, a private flight, small, unmarked, that had been waiting at a private terminal she'd accessed through a door in the back of the courthouse parking garage. The charcoal coat was gone. She wore black now. Not mourning black, not dramatic black, just the functional, unadorned darkness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that color drew attention, and attention was a liability. She had her hair down. She looked younger than she had in the courtroom, or maybe just more like herself. The version of herself that she'd spent 6 years carefully concealing behind the performance of being Graham Holloway's unremarkable wife. The gate was old iron, tall and heavy, set between stone pillars that had been standing since her great-grandmother's time. Security cameras tracked her approach. She didn't look at them. She knew they were there the same way she knew everything about this place. Not because she'd been told, but because it was in her blood, coded somewhere below language. The way children of old families carry their inheritance in their bodies, whether they want it or not. She hadn't wanted it. For a long time, a very long time, she had actively run from it. The gate opened before she reached it. A man in a dark suit stepped forward first, followed by 3 others, and then the full complement arranged themselves in 2 lines along the courtyard flagstones the way they always had when a Vale returned to the estate. Seraphine had last seen this sight when she was 19 years old. She'd stood in almost this exact spot and told her father she was leaving, that she didn't want this, that she refused to become part of what this family had built and maintained through violence and controlled fear and the kind of power that left no room for anything as fragile as love. Her father hadn't argued. He'd only looked at her with his particular brand of patient sorrow and said that the family would be here when she was ready. She'd spent 16 years proving him wrong. The man at the head of the formation was called Emile. He'd served under her father for 30 years and had a face like weathered stone and eyes that missed nothing. He bowed his head when she reached him. Not a deep bow, not ceremonial, just the precise degree of deference that this family had always used to signal respect without diminishing itself. "Welcome home, Lady Seraphine," he said. She didn't correct the title. She'd given up correcting it the moment she'd gotten on the plane. "My father," she said, "resting. The doctor is with him." Emil straightened and held her gaze. He was very glad to hear you were coming. Tell me what I need to know. He fell into step beside her as they crossed the courtyard toward the main entrance. He spoke in the low, precise manner of someone accustomed to conveying complex information quickly and without embellishment. The patriarch, her father, Aldrich Vale, who had led this organization for 30 years with an iron hand and a rare and genuine intelligence, had suffered a cardiac event 3 weeks prior. He'd been stabilized, but the episode had exposed what the inner circle had quietly known for months. Aldrich was no longer capable of maintaining the level of function his position required. Decisions had been deferred. Alliances were holding, but only just. And within the family itself, competing interests had begun to surface in ways that would require direct and authoritative intervention before they became something that couldn't be managed. Who's been running operations? Seraphine asked. A council. Your cousin Lucien chairs it. A brief pause. He has been effective. The way Emile said the last sentence told her everything she needed to know about what he thought of Lucien Vale's effectiveness. She'd known her cousin since childhood. Lucien was 4 years older than her, charming in the way that certain people are charming when they've spent decades studying exactly what warmth looks like and taught themselves to perform it without feeling it. He was brilliant, strategic, and the most naturally political person she'd ever met, which meant he was also the most dangerous because ambition in a brilliant political mind didn't sit still. It moved, constantly, toward whatever advantage hadn't yet been taken. She would need to be careful. Her father's rooms were in the East Wing, away from the operational centers of the estate. The corridor leading there was hung with paintings that Seraphine barely glanced at. She knew every one of them, had walked past them 1,000 times as a child, and they carried the specific weight of things that had been there so long they'd become part of the walls themselves. The doctor was a compact, serious man who gave her the medical summary in clinical language while Aldrich slept behind a half-open door. Reduced cardiac output, cognitive fatigue. He could speak, could think, but the periods of clarity came in windows and needed to be conserved. How long? She asked. The doctor looked at her the way doctors look at family members when they have an answer they'd rather not give directly. The next few months will be critical. She waited until he'd left before she went in. Aldrich Vale looked smaller in sleep. He had always been a large presence, physically imposing, yes, but more than that, charged with a kind of gravitational authority that made rooms arrange themselves around him. Ill, resting, with tubes running from his arm and a monitor tracking his heart in green lines, he looked like what he actually was. A man getting old. A man who'd spent his life building something enormous and terrible and was now leaving it to whoever had the strength to carry it. Seraphine sat in the chair beside the bed. She didn't touch his hand. She'd never been demonstrative with him, even as a child. That wasn't how the Vales worked, or at least it wasn't how her branch of them worked. But she stayed there for a long time, long enough for the light outside the window to begin shifting toward late afternoon, and she thought about all the years she'd spent trying to be someone who had nothing to do with this place. She thought about Graham. She thought about what it had cost her to maintain that particular performance for 6 years. The daily labor of being small, being secondary, being the kind of woman who disappeared when the room got interesting. She'd done it because she'd had reasons. Good ones. Or reasons that had seemed good when she was 29 and desperate to prove that she could build a life on her own terms, in her own name, unconnected to everything her family represented. She hadn't expected to feel something for him. That had been the miscalculation. She'd expected the marriage to be a kind of extended solitude, two people occupying the same address without truly intersecting, which was, frankly, how most of the marriages she'd observed growing up had functioned. She hadn't expected Graham to be interesting. She hadn't expected the odd, ungainly tenderness he showed sometimes in private, completely at odds with the man he performed in public. She hadn't expected that any of it would matter. It had mattered. And then it had stopped mattering to him. And she'd spent 2 years after that in the particular hell of someone who has felt something real and watched it go entirely unreciprocated, until the marriage was nothing but architecture, a structure they both lived inside without believing in anymore. She'd filed the papers herself. She'd been the one to end it. She wanted that fact to mean something clean. It mostly just made her tired. Behind her, the door opened softly. "Cousin." Lucian Vale's voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm, low, calibrated to convey intimacy without actually offering any. She turned. He was leaning in the doorframe with the relaxed posture of someone who'd been expecting this moment and had already decided how it would go. He was still handsome in the sharp-featured way of their family, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and a smile that had always made Seraphine want to count her fingers afterward to make sure she still had them all. "Lucienne," she said, "you look tired." He said it like a compliment. "Long day. What do you need to tell me about the council?" The smile didn't change, but something behind it shifted, like a door being pulled closed. "That's a conversation for tomorrow. You've just arrived." "What do you need to tell me about the council?" she repeated. A brief pause. He came into the room and let the door close behind him, and the warmth dropped out of his expression the way sunlight drops when a cloud crosses it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly, undeniably. What remained wasn't cold exactly. It was simply accurate. The version of Lucienne he kept in reserve for people he had decided to be honest with. "The council is stable," he said. "Our Eastern partnerships have held through the transition. The financial operations have continued without interruption. By any operational metric, I've kept this family exactly where your father left it. And some of the elder members are uncomfortable with the arrangement. They believe the chair should only be held by a direct heir in the bloodline." He looked at her steadily. "That's you, Seraphine." "I know who it is." "Then you understand why I'm glad you've come home." He smiled again. This version of the smile was warmer, almost convincing. "I've been holding this together for 3 months. I'm not built for the center chair. I never pretended to be. I support you, fully, completely. The family needs its heir at the front." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. His smile widened slightly. "Get some rest. We'll meet with the council tomorrow morning." He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, steady and unhurried, the walk of a man who'd just concluded a conversation exactly the way he'd planned it. When they'd faded completely, she turned back to her father's sleeping form and sat very still for a moment. She'd spent 6 years reading a man who never showed her what he was actually thinking. It turned out that was the most useful training she could have had for coming back here. She didn't trust a single word Lucienne had said. Not because he'd lied, she wasn't sure yet whether he'd lied, but because the version of support he'd offered her was too polished, too ready, arranged in exactly the right order to sound like generosity and feel like a gift. People who genuinely supported you didn't have speeches prepared. They fumbled. They qualified. They left room for their own uncertainty. Lucienne Vale had left no room for anything. She pulled out her phone. There was a message from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. "Documents have arrived." She stared at it for 10 seconds. Then she went to find Emile. Emile was in the operations room, standing with 2 men she recognized from her father's long-ago personal staff, all 3 of them looking at a map with an expression that meant whatever they were mapping was not going well. He excused himself when she entered and came to her without being asked. "Who sent this?" She showed him the phone. He looked at the message. Something moved behind his eyes. "Where did you receive this?" "My personal line. The private one." He was quiet for a moment. "There is an attorney," he said. "She has been attempting to reach the estate for several weeks. Your father's advisors have been cautious about allowing that contact." "Why?" "Because the documents she carries are—" He paused, and Emile did not pause, which meant the pause was significant. "They relate to events that predated your father's leadership, events that some members of this family would prefer remained sealed." Seraphine put the phone in her pocket. "Get me her name." "Vivian Cross," Emile said. "She was retained by a third party to locate and deliver materials relating to the origins of the feud between this family and the Holloways." The name hit her like cold water. The Holloways, Graham's family. She stood in the operations room doorway and made herself breathe slowly, steadily, the way she'd learned to breathe in the first year of her marriage, when she'd understood that she was going to need to manage herself very carefully for a very long time. She made her face do nothing. She let her hands stay loose at her sides. "Get me Cross," she said. "Tonight, if possible." "She's close," Emil said. "She anticipated you'd want to move quickly." "Of course she did." Seraphine started back down the corridor. "And Emile, don't tell Lucien." The old man said nothing, but when she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw the faintest shift in his expression, something almost like relief. Whatever those documents contained, someone in this house already knew about them, and they'd been hoping for a very long time that the right person would finally come home to read them. 300 miles away, in a city he'd spent his career building into a monument to himself, Graham Holloway sat across from a private investigator who charged $5,000 a day and had spent the last 4 hours telling him, very carefully, that whoever had dismantled his financial infrastructure had done so with a sophistication that exceeded anything in the investigator's professional experience. "You're saying you can't find them," Graham said. "I'm saying the trail is clean in a way that takes resources and planning." "How long?" The investigator tapped a pen against his knee. "The earliest trace I've found is 18 months ago, maybe longer." 18 months ago, Graham had been married. He'd been sitting across the dinner table from Seraphine on Tuesday evenings, the only night of the week they'd reliably been in the same room, eating food neither of them had cooked and making the kind of conversation that was really just two people confirming the other one still existed. He'd never once looked at her and thought, threat. He'd never once looked at her and thought much of anything at all. He pressed his fingers against his mouth and stared at the window, and in the glass he saw the faint reflection of a man who was beginning, slowly, to understand just how badly he had failed to see what was standing right next to him. He didn't know the half of it yet, but he was going to. Vivian Cross arrived at the estate at 11:43 at night. She came in a car that had seen better decades, a dark sedan with a cracked side mirror and mud along the lower panels that suggested she'd driven roads that didn't appear on maps. Seraphine watched from the second-floor window as the headlights swept across the courtyard flagstones and the car stopped without being waved in. Emile had cleared it. That meant the outer perimeter had already run her plates, her face, the registration, and whatever else they ran on people who showed up carrying documents the family had spent decades trying to keep buried. Cross was 50-something, compact, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of posture that came from years of sitting in courtrooms and refusing to be the smallest thing in the room. She carried a single leather satchel. She didn't look up at the windows. She walked toward the entrance with the unhurried directness of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular door to open. Seraphine met her in the study off the main hall, a room her father used for private meetings, paneled in dark wood, with 2 chairs arranged near a fireplace that hadn't been lit. She didn't light it. She wanted the room to feel exactly like what it was, functional. A space where information changed hands, not a place for comfort. "Miss Cross," she said, "Lady Seraphine." Cross sat without being invited, which Seraphine registered as intentional. "I appreciate you seeing me quickly. I want to be clear about who retained me before we go any further, because that context matters." "Then be clear." Cross set the satchel on her knees and kept both hands on it. "I was retained 14 months ago by a man named Harlan Beckett. He's a former federal archivist who spent 30 years cataloging private financial records seized during various federal investigations. When he retired, he kept copies of certain materials that he believed were never properly examined. He came to me because he wanted them delivered to someone with standing to act on them, and because he was afraid of what would happen if they ended up in the wrong hands first." "Where's Beckett now?" "Dead," Cross said. 6 weeks ago. Cardiac event, officially." She paused. "He was 61 and ran 6 miles every morning." The fire that wasn't burning seemed to get colder. Seraphine kept her face still. "Show me what you have." Cross opened the satchel. The documents inside were a mixture of originals and high-quality reproductions. Financial records, correspondence, what appeared to be internal memoranda from entities that no longer existed under those names. Cross laid them on the low table between the chairs in a specific order, which meant she'd arranged them in advance, which meant she'd thought carefully about how this revelation should land. Seraphine looked at the first page, then the second. By the third, she had to make a conscious decision to keep her breathing even. The documents detailed a series of transactions and communications spanning nearly 4 decades. They described, in the dry and meticulous language of financial and legal record-keeping, how the marriage between Seraphine Alora Vale and one Graham Cole Holloway had been conceived, engineered, and executed not by accident or affection or the random collision of two people at a mutual acquaintance's event, but by design. Specific, deliberate, multi-generational design. It hadn't started with her father. It had started before either of them was born. The feud between the Vale family and the Holloway family, Cross said, her voice low and precise, goes back to a business partnership formed in the early 1970s. The details are in Section 3. The short version is that both families were expanding into the same territories through different methods. The Vales, through private international networks. The Holloways, through corporate infrastructure and political access. There was an agreement. It was violated. People died as a result. Both sides blamed the other, and both sides were at least partially right. She tapped a page near the center of the stack. What neither side ever acknowledged publicly was that the violation was engineered by a third party with interests in seeing both organizations weaken each other. Who was the third party? That's the part that took 14 months to document properly. Cross looked at her directly. A man named Victor Holloway. Seraphine went very still. Graham's father, who was, at the time the original agreement was formed, a junior member of the Holloway family with no formal authority and significant grievances about his position within it. Cross's voice didn't change register. She delivered this the way a good attorney delivered everything, as fact, stripped of drama, because the facts were dramatic enough without assistance. Victor Holloway spent the better part of 3 decades manufacturing a war between his own family and yours. He fed false intelligence to both sides. He arranged for the disappearance of intermediaries who might have brokered peace. He profited from the resulting chaos, because while both organizations were occupied with each other, he was quietly consolidating the very territories the original agreement had been designed to share. Seraphine stood up. She needed to be on her feet. She couldn't sit with this information pressing down on her from above like something structural was failing. The marriage, she said, was Victor's design. Specifically, he identified you when you were in your late teens, during a period when your whereabouts were less closely monitored. He identified Graham at the same time. He spent years arranging the conditions under which you would meet, through a chain of social connections that each appear, in isolation, entirely coincidental. Cross paused. His intention was to place you within the Holloway sphere of influence before the Vale family recognized what you were, and to keep Graham close enough to you that any intelligence you might carry, knowingly or not, was accessible. Graham didn't know. Almost certainly not. Victor kept his operations extremely compartmentalized. Cross folded her hands over the documents. Graham Holloway was, in his father's design, a delivery mechanism. Nothing more. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, a door closed heavily. Wind moved through the trees that bordered the north wall. Seraphine thought about 6 years. She thought about Tuesday dinners and a man who looked through her like she was glass and the specific texture of a loneliness that she'd never been able to fully explain even to herself, because it wasn't the loneliness of being alone. It was the loneliness of being beside someone who had decided, on some level she couldn't locate, that she wasn't worth the effort of actually seeing. She thought about how she'd believed, for a long time, that his indifference was personal, that she had failed to be enough of something. Interesting enough, warm enough, present enough. She thought about Victor Holloway at his son's wedding, white-haired and patrician, with a handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time and eyes that were watchful in a way she'd noticed and filed away and never fully examined. "He was watching me that day," she said. "He's been watching you for a long time," Cross said. Seraphine turned back from the window. "Who else has seen these documents?" "Beckett, myself, and one other, a member of your father's legal staff who I reached out to before Beckett died." That person is the one who told me to wait for you specifically. Name: Theodora Marsh. She's been with your father's advisors for 11 years. Seraphine filed the name. Leave the originals. Take the reproductions with you and put them somewhere that isn't connected to you. A secure deposit, a third party, something redundant. Already done. Cross stood, leaving the documents on the table. There's one more thing. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a single folded sheet. Beckett included this separately. It's a list of names, that people he believed Victor Holloway has used to monitor your family's activities inside the organization itself. Seraphine took the sheet. She unfolded it. The third name from the top was Lucian Vale. She stood with the paper in her hand for a moment, then folded it again along its original creases. Thank you, Ms. Cross, she said. Emile will see you out. She waited until the study door closed before she moved. Then she went to the fireplace mantel and stood with both hands gripping the stone edge. Not for support exactly, just for something solid under her palms while she processed what she'd just been handed. The documents behind her represented the architecture of a deception so patient, so structurally comprehensive, that it had taken almost 4 decades to approach anything like daylight. Her marriage hadn't been an accident. Her estrangement from her family hadn't been her choice alone. It had been cultivated by a man she'd met precisely twice, who had spent decades ensuring that the Vale heir would be isolated, alienated, and conveniently removed from the center of power. And Lucienne, who had chaired the council for 3 months with impeccable results. Lucienne, who had greeted her arrival with perfectly calibrated warmth and perfectly timed deference. Lucienne, whose name appeared on an archivist's list of suspected informants for a man who had spent 30 years quietly destroying both their families from the inside. She straightened. She picked up the documents from the table and locked them in the desk drawer with a key she kept on her person. Then she went to find the one person on this estate she was beginning to think she might actually trust. Emile was in the corridor outside the operations room, as if he'd never left. Theodora Marsh, she said. A long pause. Yes. She's been with us for 11 years? She has. And she kept these documents from reaching the family for several weeks. Why? Emile was quiet for a moment, not evasive. The quality of his silence was more like a man who had been carrying something heavy and was deciding how to set it down carefully. She was afraid, he said. She brought the matter to me 3 weeks ago. I told her to wait until you arrived. He held her gaze. I told her it was for you, specifically. Seraphine looked at him. You knew I was coming before I called. I believed you would come, he said. When your father's condition became what it is, I believed you would understand there was no longer any other option. You could have contacted me directly. I didn't believe you would have listened, Emile said. Not to me. Not then. The faintest shift in his expression. Not apology, not quite, but something adjacent to it. You needed to make the choice yourself. She thought about arguing with that. She decided it wasn't worth the time. Lucienne, she said. Emile's face closed like a window being shut. What do you know? His name is on a list of suspected informants connected to Victor Holloway. She watched the old man's face carefully. When did you start suspecting him? 8 months ago, Emile said. There were inconsistencies in our operational security. Small things. The kind of things that only matter in aggregate. I began documenting them. He paused. I have not shared my documentation with the council. Good. Don't. She folded her arms. How many people are loyal to him rather than the family? Among the core staff, perhaps 20%. Among the outer network, less than that. But the 20% who are his are positioned in places that matter. Emile's voice was flat, measured, the voice of someone walking through a minefield he'd been studying for a long time. If he believes he's been identified, he will move quickly. Then we move first, Seraphine said. But not tonight. Tonight I need you to do something for me. Of course. Find me everything we have on Victor Holloway, not the public record, the real record. Emile was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, that will require opening files your father sealed 12 years ago. Open them. Another pause, shorter this time. As you say, She left him to it and walked back through the long corridor toward her father's wing, moving through the estate's nighttime quiet with the particular alertness of someone who has recently learned that the ground they're standing on has been mined for decades and is only now beginning to understand the pattern. In the city, Graham Holloway hadn't slept. He sat at the desk in his home office at 2 in the morning with the investigator's preliminary report in front of him and a glass of water he hadn't touched, and a headache building behind his left eye that had been building since Marcus's first phone call and showed no interest in stopping. He'd sent his staff home. He needed the house quiet because quiet was the only condition under which he could think clearly, and right now thinking clearly felt like the most important thing he'd ever needed to do. The investigator had given him a thread. Not much. A single financial entity, dormant for 7 years, that appeared in the background of 2 of the frozen accounts as a reference point in correspondence he wasn't supposed to have been able to access. The entity's registration was offshore, its beneficial ownership obscured through 3 layers of holding companies, and it bore a name that meant nothing to Graham on its surface. Meridian Title Holdings. He'd run it through every database he had access to: corporate registrations, litigation history, regulatory filings. Nothing useful. The name appeared and disappeared from documents like a ghost, present in passing references, never as a principal, always at exactly 1 remove from whatever action was actually taking place. At 1:45 in the morning, he tried a different approach. He called a man named Patterson, who he'd been in college with and who now worked in a capacity that was never precisely defined, somewhere in the overlap between financial intelligence and government regulatory enforcement. Patterson answered on the 4th ring, which meant he'd been awake. "Graham." "Meridian Title Holdings," Graham said. "Tell me what you know." A pause, long enough to be significant. "Where did you come across that name?" "It's in documents connected to an enforcement action against my accounts." Another pause. When Patterson spoke again, his voice had dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "That name has come up in 3 separate federal investigations over the past decade. Each time it appears, it's peripheral to the primary target. Each time the investigators get close to the beneficial ownership, something happens to the case. A witness becomes unavailable. A filing gets lost in transfer. A jurisdiction issue emerges that takes 18 months to untangle. Someone's protecting it. Someone with resources and patience and very good lawyers," Patterson said. "I can't tell you more than that on this line." "Then meet me. Graham, tomorrow morning, early, pick the place." A long breath on the other end. "This is going to cost you more than money." "I know," Graham said. "Just tell me where." He put the phone down and stared at the report on his desk. The headache was worse. Outside his window, the city hummed its indifferent nighttime hum. He thought about Marcus's voice on the phone that afternoon. The barely contained panic, the disbelief. He thought about 20 years of building something, of 16-hour days and calculated risks, and the specific bone-deep satisfaction of watching something grow into more than you'd imagined when you started. He thought about Seraphine sitting across a courtroom table, her hands flat and still, signing her name without hesitation. He thought about the way she'd moved through their shared house, always peripheral, always quiet, occupying space so efficiently that sometimes days would pass, and he'd realize, with a mild guilt he never acted on, that he hadn't looked at her directly in all that time. He'd assumed she was grateful for what he provided. The house, the resources, the social position. He'd assumed her quietness was contentment, and her stillness was simplicity, and her refusal to argue with him about anything significant was evidence of a nature that ran shallow. He was beginning to understand in the particular sick clarity of a very late night that he had been the shallow one, that he had looked at a surface and called it a depth, because looking harder would have required something he hadn't been willing to give. He didn't know yet what she was. He didn't know the estate or the family or the iron gates. He didn't know her name meant something that would have made his company's investors nervous and his attorney pale. But he knew, he felt it, somewhere below reasoning, in the animal place where threat registers before thought, that what was being done to him right now was not random. It was architectural. Someone who understood his structure had found every load-bearing wall and was removing them in sequence. The only person who had ever lived inside his structure close enough to learn it that way had been his wife, his ex-wife. He picked up the investigator's report again and stared at the name, Meridian Tidal Holdings. He was still staring at it when, 300 miles away, the first of the sealed files from Aldrich Vale's archives reached Seraphine's hands. She read for 2 hours without stopping. The files were dense, accumulated over decades, cross-referenced with a meticulous care that told her whoever had maintained them had understood they might someday need to function as evidence rather than simply record. They covered the original partnership agreement between the Vale and Holloway organizations, the precise timeline of its collapse, the deaths that followed, the retaliations, the escalating cycle that had cost both families blood and resources and years. And they covered in careful and damning detail the fingerprints of a third force consistently present at every critical juncture. Always at one remove, always deniable, always profitable. Victor Holloway's shadow ran through 30 years of her family's history like a crack through stone. She sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers against her eyes. The clock on the desk read 3:47. The estate was silent around her in the way old buildings are silent at that hour. Not empty exactly, just compressed, all its accumulated weight pressing down through the floors and walls. She thought about her father lying in that room at the end of the East Wing corridor and what it must have cost him, over all those years, to carry the possibility that someone had been inside the machinery of everything he'd built. She thought about Lucienne, who had been in an operational capacity for the last 3 months, with access to exactly the kind of intelligence that Victor Holloway would have found most useful. Lucienne, who chaired a council that made decisions about the family's external alliances and internal security. Lucienne, who had greeted her last night with a warmth so precisely deployed, it should have been her first signal. She pulled out the folded sheet Cross had given her. She unfolded it again and looked at the third name. Then she took a photo of it on her phone and put the original in the locked drawer with the other documents. She needed to be certain before she moved. Lucienne was not the kind of man you accused on the basis of a name on a dead archivist's list. He was the kind of man who, if accused prematurely, would use the accusation itself as evidence of instability on her part, turn it back on her in front of the council, and walk away from the confrontation with more credibility than he'd had going in. He was that good. She needed proof he couldn't reframe. The question was where to find it before he realized she was looking. She was still mapping the problem when her phone buzzed. A message from an estate security number, one of the perimeter monitors. She read it and stood up immediately. Movement on the North Access Road. Single vehicle. No advance notice. She was out the door before she'd finished reading. Emile met her in the operations room with 2 of the senior security staff. The monitor feed showed a dark car moving slowly up the road that connected the estate to the secondary mountain pass. Not the main road Cross had used, but the older approach. The one that didn't show up in current mapping and that only a specific category of person would know to use. Plates? She asked. Diplomatic registry, Emile said. The registration traces to a shell company. He paused. The same shell company appeared in the perimeter logs 4 months ago, before your arrival, during a period when Lucienne was running communications. Seraphine looked at the monitor for 3 seconds. The car had stopped at the outer tree line. It sat there, engine running, lights off. Lucien's current location, she said. His rooms, one of the security staff said, as of 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes was enough time to make a phone call. She kept her voice level. Wake the inner perimeter. Do not alert the council. Do not alert Lucien. She held Emile's gaze. I want to know who's in that car. The old man was already moving. She stood in front of the monitor and watched the dark vehicle at the edge of the tree line and felt the situation crystallizing around her. The documents in the locked drawer, the name on the list, the car on the road that only the family's oldest allies and enemies knew to use. She was 48 hours home after 16 years of running, and the house she'd returned to was already a burning building she was standing in the middle of. The car door opened. A figure stepped out. The infrared monitor rendered them in green-gray light, tall, male, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected to be received. The security officer beside her pulled up a secondary camera, angling from the gatehouse, and zoomed to face level. Seraphine looked at the screen. She knew the face. Not from the estate, not from her family's world, from a fundraising dinner 4 years into her marriage, where she'd stood beside Graham and shaken hands with an older man who'd held her grip exactly 2 seconds too long and watched her with the careful, assessing attention of someone taking inventory. Victor Holloway was standing at the edge of her family's land in the middle of the night, and the only person who could have told him she was here was someone who already knew it from the inside. Her phone buzzed again. Different number. Unknown. She answered without speaking. "Hello, Seraphine?" The voice was smooth, unhurried, with the particular ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime in rooms where he controlled every variable. "I've been looking forward to speaking with you directly for quite some time." She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the monitor. "I think we're past the point where pretending serves either of us," Victor Holloway said. "You've seen the documents. I know you have, because I know exactly how quickly Vivian Cross moves once she believes she has the right audience." A pause. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because the situation is becoming complicated in ways that could damage both our interests if we allow it to proceed without a direct conversation." "You're trespassing," she said. "I'm waiting at your outer perimeter. There's a meaningful difference." She could hear the smile in it, the practiced, relaxed condescension of a man who'd never once believed he could be stopped by someone he'd spent 30 years maneuvering. "Invite me in, Seraphine. Let's settle this the way adults settle things." She looked at Emile, who had returned to her side. She looked at Victor Holloway on the monitor, standing in the green-gray infrared dark at the edge of the trees. She thought about 30 years of files. She thought about a list with her cousin's name on it. She thought about Graham Holloway sitting somewhere in that city, not sleeping, staring at a name he didn't yet understand, dismantling the ruins of everything he'd believed was solid. She thought about the fact that Victor Holloway had just made a mistake, perhaps the first real one he'd made in decades. Because the one thing 30 years of patient, remote manipulation had failed to account for was what happened when the woman he'd spent those 30 years maneuvering finally came home and decided she was done being moved. "Tell the perimeter to hold position," she said to Emile quietly. Then she put the phone back to her ear. "Come to the gate," she said. "Alone." She ended the call before he could respond. Emile looked at her. "Lady Seraphine." "I know," she said. "Get Theodora Marsh. Get her now and bring her to the East Study before he reaches the door." She was already moving. "And put someone outside Lucian's room." "You believe he'll run?" She didn't slow down. "I believe," she said, "that Lucian Vale has been working for that man for years, and that man just announced his position to us, which means either he's lost his patience or someone told him he needed to move tonight." She reached the corridor. "Either way, we're out of time." Behind her, the estate began to move, carefully, without sound. The way old organizations move when they've done this before, and not with panic, but with the compressed, purposeful momentum of a machine that has been waiting for exactly this moment to engage. Victor Holloway was at the gate, and every document he'd spent 30 years trying to keep buried was locked in a drawer 40 meters from where Seraphine Vale was walking to meet him. The gate opened at 3:59 in the morning. Seraphine stood in the main entrance of the estate and watched Victor Holloway walk across the courtyard flagstones with the unhurried, proprietary ease of a man who believed he belonged in every room he entered. He was older than she remembered from the fundraising dinner, the white hair thinner now, the face more deeply creased, but the quality of his movement hadn't changed. He walked like someone who had never once in his life been uncertain about his right to be where he was. That specific confidence, the kind you couldn't perform because it came from decades of never being stopped, was its own kind of danger. He had one man with him despite having sat alone. Seraphine noted the man's position, his build, the way his right hand stayed loose at his side. She said nothing about the violation. She filed it. "Seraphine." Victor stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her 4 years ago, with the careful, measuring attention of an appraiser who already knows the value and is simply confirming it. "You look well, under the circumstances." "Come inside," she said. She took him to the East Study. Not the operations room, not her father's wing, not anywhere that contained anything she was still actively using. The East study was a room she'd chosen deliberately. Paneled walls, 2 chairs, the unlit fireplace, and nothing in it that she wasn't prepared for him to see. She'd had a meal clear at 20 minutes before the gate opened. Victor sat. She did not. She stood near the window with her arms at her sides and let him settle into the room on his own terms because she wanted to watch how he inhabited space when he believed he had the advantage. He looked at the empty desk, at the bookshelves, at the arrangement of the furniture. His eyes moved the way experienced people's eyes move, cataloging, assessing, noting what was present and what had been removed. "Vivian Cross met with you tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "She gave you documents from Harlan Beckett's collection." "She did." "And you've read them." He leaned back slightly in the chair, one hand resting on his knee. "So you know the architecture, the original partnership, the collapse, my involvement in the years between." He said it evenly, without flinching, the way men confess to things they've already decided they won't be held accountable for. "That must have been a significant evening." "Why are you here, Victor?" "Because the documents Beckett compiled are incomplete," he said. "And the incomplete version of a story is more dangerous than no story at all." She said nothing. She waited. The fireplace behind her was cold stone. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the mountain trees with a low, persistent sound. "The original feud," Victor said, "did not begin with the partnership agreement. That agreement was itself the consequence of something that happened before it, a specific act of violence that your family committed against mine, which your father chose to excise from every record he controlled." He held her gaze. "Beckett's files document what I did. They don't document what I was responding to." "You're telling me there's a prior chapter?" "I'm telling you that 30 years of what you read tonight had a cause, and that cause was Aldrich Vale ordering the murder of my brother." The room didn't move. The walls stayed where they were. Seraphine stood at the window and felt the floor hold steady under her feet and made herself treat the sentence as information rather than detonation. "Keep going," she said. "My brother's name was Daniel." Something crossed Victor's face, brief, quickly suppressed, but real in a way almost nothing else about this man appeared to be. He was part of the original negotiating team for the partnership agreement. He discovered during those negotiations that your grandfather had been systematically defrauding the terms of the preliminary arrangement, skimming from the shared financial infrastructure before the formal partnership had even been signed. He brought the evidence to Aldrich directly, privately, as a gesture of good faith. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your father had him killed within the week, made it look like an accident, and then he signed the partnership agreement as though nothing had happened." Seraphine stood very still. "When did you find out?" 3 years after it happened. A man who'd been present at the meeting between Daniel and your father came to me. He was dying. He wanted to clear his conscience." Victor's voice stayed flat, but the flatness was the kind you construct over something that's been burning for a long time and needs constant management. "I was 26 years old. I had just lost my brother to a man who then shook my family's hand across a conference table and called himself our partner." He paused. "So yes, I spent the next 30 years taking everything from Aldrich Vale that I could reach without touching what he loved most." "And then you decided to touch what he loved most," Seraphine said. "I decided to place you in a position where I could observe you, monitor you, ensure that whatever you knew or didn't know about your father's past remained accessible to me." His eyes were very steady. "I did not arrange your marriage to hurt you, Seraphine. That was not the intention." "The intention is irrelevant," she said. "The execution is what I'm looking at." "Fair." He inclined his head slightly. "But here's what I need you to understand. The information I came to retrieve tonight, what I believed Beckett's files contained, I no longer want suppressed. I want it used." He leaned forward slightly. "Because 3 months ago, I discovered something that changes the calculation for both of us." She didn't move toward him, but she didn't move away. "Lucien Vale," Victor said, "is not working for me." The silence that followed that sentence had a different texture than the silence before it. "He has been in contact with my organization for 4 years, Victor continued. "But 3 months ago, I learned that he has been simultaneously feeding information to a third party, a rival organization, The Marin Collective, that neither your family nor mine has any interest in seeing gain regional influence. He looked at her directly. Lucien Vale has been playing all three sides. Your family, mine, and an organization that would dismantle everything both our families have built and replace it with something significantly less restrained. Seraphine walked to the chair across from him and sat down. She needed to think. She needed to do it while appearing simply to be listening. "How long have you known this?" she asked. "Confirmed, 6 weeks ago. Suspected, longer." He paused. "When I understood what Lucien was actually doing, I tried to sever the contact, cut him off from my organization's intelligence stream without triggering a reaction. But Lucien is perceptive. He knew something had changed, and in the last 3 weeks, his communications with the Marin Collective have accelerated. You came here tonight because you think he's about to move. I came here tonight because I believe he intends to use the transition of power, your assumption of leadership, as the moment to act. Your arrival creates exactly the kind of internal disruption that makes an organization temporarily vulnerable. He'll know your authority isn't yet consolidated. He'll know the Council's loyalties are still being sorted." Victor held her gaze. "If he moves in the next 72 hours, he does it during a window when your family doesn't fully trust you yet and you don't fully know who your enemies are." Seraphine sat with that. She kept her breathing even. Her hands were folded in her lap. "You came to warn me," she said. "I came to propose a temporary alignment of interests. You have spent 30 years destroying my family." "Yes." No hesitation, no qualification. "And what I built on top of that destruction is now at risk from the same man who's threatening what's left of yours." He let that sit between them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for an alliance beyond the next 72 hours. I'm asking you to consider that the enemy of what remains is currently in a room in your East Wing planning his next move, and that you and I are the only 2 people in this building tonight who know the full dimensions of what he's been doing." Seraphine looked at the unlit fireplace. She thought about the list, Lucien's name on it, the car at the tree line arriving the same night Cross had delivered the documents, the precise, terrible timing of it all. She thought about Victor Holloway ordering her marriage like a supply chain decision. She thought about her father ordering a man's death and then signing a partnership agreement and going home. She thought about Daniel Holloway, 20-something years old, walking into a meeting to report a fraud in good faith and not walking out. "Tell me what you know about the Marin Collective's timeline," she said. Victor reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the table between them. "Everything I have," he said, "in exchange for one thing. Name it." "Graham," he said. "Whatever you're doing to his financial infrastructure, stop it. He had nothing to do with any of this. He never did." Seraphine looked at the document on the table. "I'm not doing anything to Graham's infrastructure," she said. A pause. Victor's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Then who is?" She held his gaze. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something she hadn't expected to see in Victor Holloway's face. Genuine surprise. Before she could respond, the door to the east study opened. Not knocked. Opened. Emile stood in the doorframe, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been afraid of seeing since she arrived at this estate. Controlled, precise, and carrying very bad news. "Lady Seraphine," his voice was level, "you need to come now." "Lucien?" she said. "His rooms are empty," Emile said. "He left within the last 30 minutes, and the operations room has been accessed." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel like a door swinging open onto a drop. "Several of the elder council members have received communications. We don't yet know the full content, but we know they've been asked to convene. In the middle of the night." "Yes." Seraphine stood. She picked up the document Victor had placed on the table without looking at it and put it in her pocket. "Keep him here," she said to Emile, meaning Victor. Then she was through the door. She moved through the east corridor at a pace that wasn't quite running, because running announced panic, and panic was exactly what Lucien wanted her to feel right now. Her mind was sorting as she walked, cutting through the variables with the kind of cold efficiency that she recognized as something inherited rather than learned, her father's particular gift, The ability to keep processing while everything around you accelerated toward collapse. Lucien had left his rooms in the 30-minute window between her going to the gate and now, which meant someone had told him something had changed. Either he'd seen Cross's arrival on a security feed, or he'd seen Victor's car, and this was the possibility that made her jaw tighten. He had a contact inside the inner perimeter who had told him the moment Seraphine started asking about the files. The operations room was on the ground floor of the north wing. She pushed through the door to find two staff members standing over the main console, with expressions that told her the damage assessment was not going to be short. "What did he access?" she said. The senior analyst, a woman named Petra, who had been with the family for 8 years and had a manner so dry it was almost tactile, pulled up the access log without preamble. Communications archive, specifically the records from the 18 months preceding your father's illness. He pulled everything related to the Eastern Partnership communications and 2 sets of files related to council voting records. She paused. He also accessed the external contact directory. The full directory. The full directory. Seraphine put both hands flat on the console edge. The external contact directory was exactly what it sounded like. Every name, every number, every secure channel address for every person and organization the Vale family maintained relationships with, legitimate and otherwise. It was the kind of document that, in the wrong hands, could be used to warn allies that a transition was coming or to offer those relationships to a competitor at a price. "Can we invalidate it?" she said. "We can cycle the secure channels within the next 4 hours. Contact addresses? Yes. The underlying relationship data, the names, the histories, the leverage points, that's already in his possession." Petra said it without editorializing. She was the kind of person who gave you the facts and left the suffering to you. "Start cycling, now. Get everyone on it." Seraphine straightened. "Where is he physically?" "We believe he left the estate. West Perimeter shows a gate override 40 minutes ago. A vehicle exit that wasn't logged in the standard system. He used an emergency authorization code." "My father's code?" "Yes." The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had gotten louder. Rain was starting. She could hear it beginning to tap against the high windows of the north wing. Lucienne Vale had walked out of the family estate using her dying father's emergency override code and taken the entire external contact directory with him. She had underestimated him, not his ambition. She'd never underestimated that. She'd underestimated his preparation. She'd assumed he would need time to move once he understood she was a threat. She'd assumed wrong. He hadn't needed time because he'd been ready for months. The chair of the council position hadn't been a power play. It had been a staging ground. She pulled out her phone and called Emile. "Is Victor Holloway still in the East Study?" "Yes." "Bring him to the operations room." A pause on his end. "Do it, Emile." She was still standing at the console when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not the same one Cross had used. Different. She opened it. One line of text. "Check the Eastern Partnership files. Section 7. Your father knew about the marriage." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the console and stood very still while the operations room moved around her. Petra coordinating the channel cycling, 2 other analysts pulling the perimeter logs, someone on a landline speaking in quick, quiet sentences. Her father knew about the marriage, not suspected, not discovered eventually. Knew. She picked the phone back up and read the message a 3rd time. The phrasing was precise. Section 7 of the Eastern Partnership files. The same files Lucien had just pulled from the archive, which meant either this message was from Lucien himself, designed to destabilize her with one hand while he ran with the other, or it was from someone else who'd had access to those files and knew what was in Section 7 and had been waiting for the right moment to use it as a weapon. Or it was true. She left Petra in charge of the operations room and walked to the archive terminal at the far end. She pulled up the Eastern Partnership files herself and navigated to Section 7. Her access credentials cleared it immediately. The files loaded. She read for 6 minutes. 6 minutes was all it took to understand that the floor she'd been standing on was not the floor she'd thought it was. Section 7 of the Eastern Partnership files contained correspondence between Aldrich Vale and an intermediary, dated 14 years before Seraphine's marriage. in which the details of Victor Holloway's scheme to arrange the marriage were explicitly laid out. The intermediary had obtained intelligence about Victor's plan and brought it to Aldrich. The correspondence then detailed Aldrich's response, which was not to warn his daughter, not to disrupt the arrangement, but to assess whether the marriage, if allowed to proceed on Victor's timeline, could be redirected toward the Vale family's own interests. Her father had known. He'd known Victor was engineering it, and he'd decided to let it happen. Because a daughter married into the Holloway name, even by an adversary's design, was a daughter positioned inside the enemy's infrastructure. A daughter who could, when the time came, be an asset rather than a pawn. He hadn't told her. He'd let her walk into a marriage that was designed as a manipulation, knowing it was designed as a manipulation, and he'd calculated that the value of her position outweighed what it would cost her to occupy it. 6 years. She sat with the terminal screen in front of her and made herself breathe through it. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you breathe when something has hit you hard enough that the body needs a moment to confirm it's still operational. Her hands were on the edge of the terminal desk. She looked at them. They weren't shaking. She was aware that this was a minor, somewhat absurd thing to notice, but she noticed it. Her hands weren't shaking. She closed the file. When Victor Holloway arrived in the operations room with Emil 2 minutes later, he stopped when he saw her face. Whatever he'd been preparing to say, he didn't say it. He stood in the doorway and read her expression with the precision of a man who'd spent decades understanding exactly what various kinds of damage looked like on a person's face. "You found Section 7, he said. "Yes." He came into the room. Emil closed the door behind him. The analyst kept working. Petra had the good sense to redirect her staff's attention to their screens. "Your father and I," Victor said carefully, "were playing the same game from opposite sides of the table." "My father used me as a piece," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that and immediately disgusted with herself for being proud of it. "You used me as a piece. The difference is that you're standing in front of me and he's unconscious in the East Wing, and I have to decide tonight which of you I'm going to deal with first." Victor said nothing. For once, he appeared to be choosing silence over strategy. "The document you gave me," she said. "The Marin Collective's timeline. Is it real?" "Yes." "Is Lucian's cooperation with them operational or preliminary?" "Operational. He's been providing them with movement intelligence on your family's network for 8 months. In exchange, they've agreed to support him as the acting head of the Vale organization once your father is incapacitated beyond function." A pause. "Which, given current medical reports they shouldn't have access to, they appear to know is imminent." "Someone inside the medical staff," she said, "or someone who bribed them." Victor sat down, uninvited. He looked tired in a way that she thought might be real. "Seraphine, I need you to hear something." She waited. "I came here tonight because Lucien is about to hand your family's entire network to an organization that will strip it for parts. Everything your father built, everything the Vale name has maintained, the infrastructure, the relationships, the protection of the people inside it, all of it gets dismantled and absorbed into a collective that has no interest in preservation." He held her gaze. "I spent 30 years trying to take pieces of what your father built because it was mine, by rights, and he'd wronged my family. But I never wanted it destroyed. There's a difference between wanting to defeat something and wanting to erase it." He paused. "The Marin Collective wants to erase it." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. "And Graham," she said, "if it's not me dismantling his financials, and it's not you, who is it?" Victor's jaw moved. "I have a theory," he said slowly, "but you're not going to like it." Before he could continue, Petra's voice cut across the room from the main console, flat and urgent, the voice of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. "We have a problem." Petra turned from her screen. "The council members Lucien contacted tonight. 3 of them have responded. They're convening at the secondary location, the mountain property, in 2 hours." She paused. "And they've issued a formal challenge to Lady Seraphine's assumption of authority on the grounds that the transition was unauthorized without full council ratification." The room held still for half a second. Seraphine understood immediately what Lucien had done. He hadn't run. He'd moved. While she'd been reading files and processing betrayals, he'd been activating the pieces he'd spent 3 months positioning. The council challenge wasn't a last resort, it was the primary strategy. If he could get enough council members to ratify his interim authority before she consolidated hers, the legal structure of the organization itself would work against her. She'd be the challenger, not him. She'd be the one without standing. And the secondary mountain property was 3 hours away. She turned to Emil. How fast can we get there? By helicopter, 40 minutes. He met her eyes. The weather's deteriorating. She looked at the window. The rain against the glass had gotten heavier. Mountain weather in the middle of the night in a helicopter with a timetable that left no room for the storm to decide to become something worse. Prep it, she said. Seraphine, Victor started. You're coming with me, she said. She didn't phrase it as an invitation. If what you've given me is real, I need it sourced by someone the council can't dismiss. You're that source, whether you want to be or not. She held his gaze. And if it's not real, I want you where I can see you. Victor Holloway looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that she didn't have a word for. Not respect exactly, but something that had the same weight as respect without the warmth. All right, he said. She turned back to the room. Petra, everything Lucian accessed tonight, I want a parallel archive started on an isolated system. Now. Emil, get Theodora Marsh to the helicopter pad in 20 minutes. I need a witness who's been inside this from the beginning. She moved toward the door. And someone get me a secure line to Graham Holloway. Petra looked up from her console. Graham Holloway, Yes. She didn't slow down. He's 300 miles away in a city where someone is currently destroying everything he owns. And based on what I just read, I think I know who ordered it. And I think he's the only other person in this situation who has as much to lose as I do and as much reason to want the truth. She reached the door. Find me a number that works. She stepped out into the corridor and kept moving, and behind her the operations room shifted into a different gear. Faster, more focused. The particular energy of people who have understood that the situation is past the point of preparation and entered the territory of response. The estate around her was fully awake now, lights in corridors that had been dark an hour ago, staff moving with purpose rather than patrol rhythm. The building itself seemed to have changed register, the way old structures do when the people inside them have stopped pretending that everything is fine and started dealing with what actually is. She reached the staircase and paused with one hand on the banister. Her father. Her marriage. 30 years of a war she'd been born inside without knowing the geography. A cousin who'd spent years selling her family's survival to the highest bidder. A man she'd been married to who was right now sitting in ruins that someone had engineered from a distance and who was innocent of every part of it. She thought about the morning, the courtroom, the charcoal coat, and the hands flat on the table, and the signature. She thought about 6 years of being treated as furniture by a man who, it turned out, had been placed beside her by forces neither of them had ever seen. She'd spent 6 years resenting an indifference that was, in its way, the only honest thing in the entire arrangement, because Graham Holloway, for all his failures, had at least been exactly what he appeared to be. She started up the stairs. She had 40 minutes before the helicopter needed to leave. She was going to her father's room first, because whatever else happened tonight, whatever she found at the mountain property, and whatever it cost her to get there, she needed to stand in that room and know, before she walked into the next phase of this, whether her father was capable of looking at her when he woke up. She needed to know if he would. The East Wing corridor was quiet. The door to her father's room was half open, the way it had been all night. She pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside. The monitor tracked his heart in its steady green lines. The tubes, the window, the smell of antiseptic under something older, wood and time, and the particular mustiness of a room that had held a powerful man's presence for decades. Aldrich Vale was awake. He was watching the door when she came in, which meant he'd heard her in the corridor, or he'd been awake for a while and waiting. His eyes were clear, clearer than the doctor's assessment had suggested they would be at this hour. He looked at her with an expression she'd last seen on his face when she was 19 years old and telling him she was leaving, patient, sorrowful. And behind both of those things, something she recognized now that she hadn't then. Guilty. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him. Section 7, she said. He closed his eyes. That was all she needed. She stood there for 5 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back out the door, And her footsteps down the corridor were perfectly even, perfectly controlled, and she did not look back because looking back was not something she could afford to do anymore. And because the helicopter was waiting and the storm was building and Lucien Vale was 40 minutes away in a room full of people he'd spent months convincing that she was the wrong choice, and every second she spent standing still was a second she was handing him. She reached the end of the corridor and pushed through the door to the outer passage. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Ms. Vale? The voice was male, young, clipped, the voice of someone reading from a prepared statement under pressure. My name is Darian Moss. I'm a paralegal with a firm in the city. I've been instructed to contact you in the event that my employer becomes unreachable. A pause. My employer is Vivian Cross. Seraphine stopped walking. Cross became unreachable 47 minutes ago, the young man said. Her car was found abandoned on the mountain access road. There is no sign of her. The corridor was very cold suddenly, or it felt that way. The reproduction she was carrying, Seraphine said. The backup copies. Gone, Darian Moss said. The secure deposit location was accessed 2 hours ago. The box is empty. Someone had taken the only redundant copies of the documents that could corroborate everything Cross had delivered. Someone who had known exactly where Cross had put them and had moved on that location in the same window that Lucien was exiting the estate. This wasn't Lucien acting alone. This was coordinated. Multiple moving pieces, multiple locations. A timeline that had been running parallel to everything she'd been doing tonight, matching her move for move, staying exactly one step ahead. She thought about Victor Holloway's face when she'd told him she wasn't the one dismantling Graham's financial infrastructure. Genuine surprise. If it wasn't her, and it wasn't Victor, and it wasn't Lucien who was focused on the internal coup, Lucien whose play was the council, not a corporate demolition 300 miles away. Then there was a fourth player. Someone who had been watching all three sides of this for long enough to know every move before it was made. Someone who had access to Cross's secure deposit information, which Cross would only have shared with someone she trusted completely. Someone who had been inside this long enough to know that tonight, of all nights, was the right moment to pull every thread simultaneously and watch the whole structure come down. She stood in the corridor with the phone at her ear and felt the situation expand around her into something significantly larger and more dangerous than anything she'd walked into this estate prepared to handle. Mr. Moss, she said. Where are you right now? The office, he said. I didn't know where else to... Stay there. Don't contact anyone. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't give you the name Emile. She was already moving again. And Mr. Moss, does the firm have any other files related to the Holloway Vale matter? Anything Cross hadn't yet delivered? A pause, papers shuffling. There's one more envelope, he said. Cross sealed it herself. It's marked, to be opened only if both parties are in the same room. Seraphine's jaw tightened. Both parties. Her and Graham. Cross had known from the beginning that this was going to end up requiring both of them in the same space. She'd structured her delivery that way deliberately. Staged it, sequenced it, held the last piece back for a condition that hadn't yet been met. Which meant the last piece was the one that explained everything. The piece that tied Victor's 30-year campaign and Aldrich's calculated silence, and Graham's engineered marriage and Lucien's defection, and the Marin Collective's timeline into a single coherent picture. The piece that named the fourth player. And the only way to open it was to be in the same room as a man she'd divorced that morning who was currently 300 miles away watching his empire burn. Hold that envelope, she said. With your life if necessary. She ended the call and walked faster through the corridor, and the rain against the high windows was louder now, and somewhere above the mountain the storm was building into something that was going to make the next 40 minutes in a helicopter genuinely unpleasant. And none of that mattered because she was out of time and out of ground, and the only move left was forward into the dark with whatever she had in her hands right now. Which was not enough, but it was going to have to be. The helicopter lifted at 4:22 in the morning into a sky that did not want them there. Rain hit the fuselage in sheets, lateral and hard, driven by a mountain wind that had no interest in the schedules of people who needed to be somewhere. The pilot, a compact, stone-faced woman named Raelle, who had flown for the Vale family for 11 years and had the kind of calm that came from having survived situations significantly worse than bad weather, kept her hand steady on the controls, and said nothing reassuring, which Seraphine found more comforting than reassurance would have been. Victor Holloway sat across from her with his seatbelt fastened and his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who had decided, at some point in the last hour, that he was committed to this course of action regardless of what it cost him. Theodora Marsh sat beside him, small, 60-ish, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and eyes that had been carrying something heavy for a long time and were visibly relieved to be setting it down. She'd brought a leather portfolio with her. She held it against her chest with both arms. Emil had stayed at the estate. Someone had to. Before the helicopter lifted, he'd gripped Seraphine's forearm for exactly 2 seconds. No words, just the pressure of a man communicating something that didn't have a clean verbal form, and then released her and walked back toward the estate entrance without looking back. Seraphine had her phone out. The secure line to Graham Holloway had been established 12 minutes ago by Petra, who had routed it through 3 relay points and told her it was as clean as anything could be at 4 in the morning, with hostile actors potentially monitoring standard channels. She called it now. It rang 4 times. She was preparing for voicemail when he picked up. "Who is this?" Not a question. The voice of a man who hadn't slept and had stopped being civil about it. "It's Seraphine," she said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to have weather inside it. "How did you get this number?" he said. "The same way I got everything tonight. Graham, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do it without asking me to justify myself because we don't have time for that. It's 4 in the morning. I know what time it is." The helicopter lurched sideways. Rael corrected it smoothly. And Seraphine kept her voice level. "Your financial infrastructure is being dismantled. You know that. What you don't know is who's doing it and why. And I need to tell you because it's connected to what's happening on my end, and both of us are running out of time to act independently." Another silence. She could hear him breathing. She could almost feel him deciding whether to hang up or stay on the line. The specific weight of a man's pride when it's in direct conflict with his survival instinct. Survival won. "Talk," he said. She talked. She gave him the compressed version, Victor's 30-year campaign, her father's calculated silence, the marriage's engineered positioning. She gave it to him clean and fast, without softening the parts that reflected badly on her or on the family she'd come from, because softening was a luxury neither of them could afford, and because Graham Holloway, for all the ways he'd failed her, had never been a man who benefited from being handled carefully. He needed the unvarnished version, or he'd spend the next hour picking at the varnish instead of dealing with the information underneath. She stopped before she told him about the 4th player. She needed him in the same room for that part. When she finished, he was quiet for so long she thought she'd lost the connection. "Graham? I'm here." His voice had changed register. Something had gone out of it. The defensive tension that had been present since he answered. What remained was quieter and harder. The voice of a man who had just had a significant portion of his self-narrative removed surgically and was assessing the wound. "Your father knew. About the marriage." "Yes." "And you didn't?" "No." Another pause. "Okay," he said. It was a single syllable carrying about 40 pounds of things he wasn't saying. "I need you to come to the city," she said. "There's an attorney's office. I'll send you the address. There's a document there that requires both of us present to open. I believe it identifies the 4th player, the one who's currently coordinating against both of us simultaneously." "4th player," he repeated. "You mean someone beyond your father, your cousin, and mine?" "Yes." "Who?" "I don't know yet. That's what the document is for." The helicopter hit turbulence. Real turbulence. The kind that picks the aircraft up and drops it 6 feet in a direction that feels wrong for everything. Victor's hand gripped the seat edge. Marsh made no sound. "I have something to do first. I need 2 hours. Can you be at that office in 2 hours?" "Seraphine." His voice was very even. "Why are you in a helicopter at 4 in the morning?" "Because my cousin is 40 minutes away trying to stage a coup using my father's emergency authorization codes and a council challenge. And if I don't get there before the vote is called, I lose the authority to do anything about any of this." She kept her eyes forward. 2 hours, Graham." A breath. "Send me the address." She ended the call and put the phone in her pocket and looked out the rain-streaked window at the absolute dark of the mountain below them. Victor was watching her. She didn't acknowledge it. He'll come? Victor said. Yes. You trust him. She thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. I trust that his interests and mine are currently identical. That's enough. Victor said nothing. He looked out his own window, and in the reflection she could see his face, older, tired, carrying the specific weight of a man who had spent 30 years being certain and was now, in the space of a single night, confronting the possibility that certainty had cost him more than it had given him. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she noted it. The secondary mountain property appeared below them 22 minutes later. A cluster of lights in the dark, set into a plateau carved into the mountain's upper face. It was smaller than the main estate, but older, built when the family's priorities had been fortification over elegance. Stone walls, narrow windows, a single central hall that her grandfather had used for exactly this kind of convening. The kind of place built by people who understood that the moments when an organization decided its own leadership were also the moments when it was most vulnerable to being decided wrong. 3 vehicles were already in the courtyard below. More lights on in the main hall than should have been at this hour. He got here fast, Victor said. He left before I did. Seraphine was already unclipping her seatbelt before Rael had fully set them down. He had a head start, and he used it. The landing pad was 40 meters from the property's north entrance. The rain hit her the moment she stepped out. Cold, direct. The kind of mountain rain that doesn't apologize for itself. She walked fast, head down, with Victor on her left and Marsh on her right, and the wind pushed at them from the east like it was trying to make a point. The north entrance guard recognized her and started to step aside. Then he hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know about what Lucien had spent the last hour communicating to the property staff. "Step aside," she said. He stepped aside. Not because he'd been told to, because something in her voice left no room for the alternative. The main hall was lit by overhead fixtures that cast everything in a flat, functional light that made the stone walls look even colder than they were. 8 people were seated at the long central table when she walked in. She recognized all of them. Senior council members, people who had served under her father for years, people who had built their careers inside the structure Aldrich Vale had constructed, and who were now sitting in a room in the middle of the night because a man they trusted had told them the future of that structure was under threat. Lucien was at the head of the table. He looked up when she entered, and his expression did something interesting. A fast, controlled adjustment, like a shutter closing, that moved him from surprised to composed in under a second. He was good. She'd known he was good. Seeing it in operation, directed at her, with everything now clear about what it was covering, made something cold move through her chest that she refused to call fear, and that was probably something closer to grief. "Seraphine." He stood. His voice carried warmth and concern with the practiced ease of someone who'd been deploying both on command for years. "I wasn't certain you'd come, given the hour, given the weather, given that you staged this in the middle of the night using my father's emergency codes to minimize the window I had to respond," she said. She didn't match his warmth. She came to the table and stood at the opposite end from him and let the room feel the distance between them. "Sit down, Lucien." A muscle in his jaw moved. He sat. She looked at the council members. 8 faces, 8 different calibrations of discomfort, some guilty, some genuinely confused, some watching the space between her and Lucien with the alert wariness of people who understand they've been placed in the middle of something and are now trying to determine the shape of it. "I know why you're here," she said. "You've been told that my assumption of the chair hasn't followed proper ratification protocol. You've been told that the transition creates instability. You've been told that an interim authority, specifically the one currently sitting at the head of this table, is the appropriate response until a formal process can be convened." She paused. "What you haven't been told is what Lucien Vale has been doing with your organization's intelligence for the past 4 years. Lucien's voice came in fast and smooth. "Seraphine has been away from this family for 16 years. She arrived last night after a personal loss, her marriage, her sense of identity, and has been processing a significant amount of new information under significant emotional pressure. I think we should be patient with the Marin Collective," Seraphine said. The room changed. Not dramatically, not with gasps or visible reactions from everyone at the table, but in three faces, the ones who'd been around long enough to know what the Marin Collective was and what it meant for any internal operator to be connected to it. She saw the specific quiet shift of people who have just heard something that rearranges everything they thought they understood about the room they're sitting in. Lucienne's composure held. It held well, but she was watching for the thing underneath it, and she saw it. A fractional tightening around his eyes that wasn't anger and wasn't guilt, but was something more dangerous than either: calculation. He was recalculating in real time, assessing what she had and what she didn't have, and whether he could survive the next 5 minutes if he stayed at this table or needed to change the nature of what was happening in this room. "That's a serious accusation," he said. His voice was very controlled. "I have documentation," she said, cross-referenced with a source who has had direct operational contact with your communication channels. She held his gaze. "I also have a witness." She looked at the north entrance. Victor Holloway walked in. The effect on the room was immediate and physical. Several council members pushed their chairs back involuntarily, and 2 of them were on their feet before they'd consciously decided to stand. Victor Holloway walking into a Vale family council session was the kind of event that didn't have a precedent, and things without precedent in old organizations create a specific quality of alarm. "What is this?" one of the council members said. A man named Rice, 70 years old, who had been Aldrich's most trusted operational advisor for 2 decades. His voice was shaking slightly, but not from fear, from something more like fury at finding himself in a situation he hadn't been prepared for. "This man has documentation of direct communications between his organization and a member of this council," Seraphine said. "He has agreed to present that documentation to this body as a witness to Lucian Vale's operational cooperation with a hostile third party." "You brought a Holloway into this house," Rice said. "I brought the only person in this situation who has 4 years of evidence of what Lucien has been doing," she said. "I understand what that costs. I'm asking you to hear it anyway." Lucien stood up. He did it slowly, deliberately, with the controlled energy of someone who has assessed the situation and decided that the only way through it is momentum. When he spoke, he directed himself to the council members rather than to Seraphine, which was the right instinct and confirmed for her that he'd already written off persuading her and was working exclusively on the room. "What you're watching right now," he said, "is a woman who has been out of this family for 16 years, walking into its most sensitive internal proceeding with a man whose family has spent 3 decades trying to destroy ours and presenting his testimony as evidence." His voice was steady, and he was making eye contact with each council member in sequence, working the room the way a skilled politician works it. Not grandstanding, just connecting, person to person. "I have served this council for 3 months. I have kept every alliance intact. I have protected every operational relationship your father built while he was unable to do it himself." He let that land. "Ask yourselves what this looks like." It looked convincing. Seraphine knew it looked convincing because Lucien was exceptional at this, and because the truth was that the room's prior loyalty to him was real, built over months of reliable performance. And she was a woman who'd been away for 16 years, asking them to override that loyalty on the basis of evidence presented at 4 a.m. by a man they'd been trained to consider an enemy. She let him finish. Then she looked at Theodora Marsh, who was standing near the entrance. "Theodora," she said. Marsh opened her portfolio. What she produced was not Victor's documentation. It was something different. Internal communications, Vale family network records, sourced entirely from within the organization's own systems, bearing authentication codes that every person in the room would recognize as legitimate. Marsh had spent 11 years building her access to exactly these materials, and she had spent the last 3 months documenting, quietly and without telling anyone except Emile, the specific pattern of intelligence leakage that had been occurring under the council's oversight. She laid the documents on the table. "These are internal," Rice said, leaning forward to look. "Yes," Marsh said. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. "I compiled them over 93 days. Each one documents an instance where operational intelligence shared exclusively within the council was subsequently acted upon by external parties with no authorized access." She tapped the top document. "The pattern of the leakage traces consistently to communications originating from the council chair's secure terminal." Lucien's face had gone very still, not the controlled stillness of his performance. The actual stillness of a man who has just seen the specific thing he didn't know existed and is now doing the rapid, terrible arithmetic of what it means for his position. Those records can be falsified, he said. By someone with access to the network authentication system, Marsh said. Yes, but falsifying them would require changing the cryptographic timestamps on 47 separate documents across a 93-day period, and the verification chain for those timestamps runs through a server that has been physically isolated from the main network for the past 6 weeks. She looked at him directly. I isolated it myself. When I started to understand what I was seeing. Lucian looked at Marsh, then at the documents, then at the room. Seraphine watched him make the decision. She saw it happen, not in a dramatic visible shift, but in a micro-adjustment of his posture, something in the set of his shoulders, a quality change in the way his eyes moved. He'd been calculating the odds of surviving the next 5 minutes inside this room, and the odds had just come back unfavorable. He moved fast. He was around the table and at the east exit in 3 seconds, and the 2 men closest to the door were not fast enough to stop him because he was moving before the room had fully processed that he was moving, and Lucien Vale had spent his entire life being the person in the room who moved before anyone else had finished thinking. Seraphine was already going. She hit the east exit 8 seconds behind him into a narrow stone corridor that ran along the building's exterior wall, lit by emergency fixtures every 10 meters. She could hear him ahead, footsteps, fast and certain, the footsteps of someone who knew this building's layout better than she did after 16 years away. He was heading for the rear of the property, toward the vehicle access that came in from the mountain's service road. She ran. Not the controlled walk of the last 2 hours. She ran, and the corridor was cold and the stone walls were close on both sides, and her breath was loud in the confined space, and she stopped thinking about anything except the sound of his footsteps and the distance between them. He hit the rear door, and she heard it crash open ahead of her. She followed through it into the open air. Rain, cold, the service road's gravel surface, 2 vehicles parked 50 meters away with their lights off. Lucienne was at the first one. She heard the door open. Lucienne! Her voice was louder than she intended. It cut through the rain and the wind, and it made him stop. Not because she'd commanded it, but because something in it caught him. The way the voice of someone who has nothing left to lose sometimes catches people who still have things they're protecting. He turned. They were 20 meters apart in the rain and the dark, and she could see his face in the faint light from the rear entrance. Angular, familiar, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been performing for so long he can no longer remember what it felt like to stop. You can't hold this, he said. You've been gone 16 years. You think one night changes that? I think the council just watched you run, she said. That changes it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt. She didn't think Lucian did guilt in any conventional sense, but something adjacent to regret, which in a man like him was probably as close to accountability as he got. The Marin Collective was never about destroying the family, he said. I was managing the relationship. Controlling what they got, keeping them close enough to satisfy without giving them anything that actually mattered. You gave them movement intelligence on our network for 8 months. I gave them enough to keep them from moving against us directly. His voice had an edge now, the edge of someone who believes they've been misunderstood, which was probably the most dangerous kind of edge Lucian Vale had. I was doing what I've always done, managing threats, keeping this family alive while your father was dying and you were 300 miles away signing divorce papers. By selling us to the people who want to dismantle us. By buying us time. He shook his head. You've been home for 1 day. You don't know what the last 3 months have been. I know what the last 4 years have been, she said. I've read the documentation. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got in the car. She ran the remaining 20 meters. She hit the driver's door before he got the engine started and wrenched it open, and Lucian grabbed her wrist and she grabbed his jacket, and for a moment they were locked together in the car door frame, with the rain coming down on both of them and the wind making noise in the trees above the service road. And she looked at her cousin's face from 8 inches away and saw something she hadn't expected to see in it. Fear. Not of her. Of what happened next. Of the world on the other side of this moment, which was a world where he'd run in front of a full council and been documented and had no more room to perform his way back to safety. "Don't do this," she said. Not a threat. She wasn't sure what it was. He released her wrist. She stepped back. He looked at her through the open door for 3 seconds. Then he got out of the car. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. The two men who'd come through the rear exit behind her reached him before she had to make a decision about what came next. They were calm and professional, and they knew exactly what they were doing, which meant Emil had briefed them before the helicopter left, which meant Emil had been running a parallel track all night to cover the outcomes she hadn't had time to plan for explicitly. She stood in the rain and watched them walk Lucian back toward the rear entrance. He didn't look back at her. Inside the main hall, she found the council in a state that was somewhere between stunned and recalibrating. Reese was on his feet at the head of the table, Lucien's former position, with the internal documents spread in front of him and an expression that told her he'd been reading them for the last 4 minutes and didn't like what he was reading but wasn't going to pretend it away. He was that kind of man, Rice, the ones who scared her less, the ones whose integrity might have inconvenient edges but was at least real. Victor Holloway was standing against the far wall, keeping himself out of the center of the room with the discipline of someone who understood that his presence was necessary but that overclaiming the moment would undermine everything. He looked at her when she came in. His right hand had a slight tremor she hadn't noticed before. She filed it without commenting on it. "Ms. Marsh's documentation," Rice said. He looked up from the papers. "Is this complete?" "Everything I was able to compile," Marsh said. "And the external source?" He looked at Victor with the careful, controlled hostility of decades of learned opposition. "What you have relates directly to Lucien's communications with the third party." "Operational records," Victor said. 4 years of them. Timestamps, content summaries, the exchange of specific intelligence that I can verify against our own operational history." He paused. "I'll provide everything to whatever verification process this council chooses." Rice looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Seraphine. "Why is he here?" "Because what's been done to this family over the last 30 years involved his, and he has documentation we needed," she said. "And because the situation we're all in right now is bigger than the history between our families, and someone in this room needs to be willing to say that out loud." Rice was quiet. The other council members were watching him because Rice was who they watched when they needed to know which way the wind was settling. "The council challenge," he said finally. "I move to suspend it pending a full evidentiary review." He looked around the table. "Agreed?" One by one, 7 heads moved in the affirmative. Seraphine's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from Petra at the main estate. "Graham Holloway is 40 minutes out from the attorney's office. He's asking if you can make it." She looked at the time. 4:58. The helicopter back, the drive into the city, the attorney's office. She could do it in 2 hours if the weather cleared enough for Rael to push the return flight. She looked at Victor Sitsi. "We need to move." "The council," one of the members started, "will reconvene at the main estate in 12 hours with full documentation for the evidentiary review," she said. "Marsh will coordinate." She looked at Marsh, who nodded once with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of clear directive for quite some time. She was at the rear exit when Rice called after her. "Lady Seraphine." She stopped, turned. The old man was still standing at the head of the table, his hands flat on the spread documents. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has served a powerful institution long enough to understand the difference between the institution and the person currently leading it. "Your father," he said, "whatever he knew, whatever decisions he made." A pause. "He was not wrong that you were the right person for this chair." She didn't know what to do with that, so she did nothing with it. She nodded once and went through the door. The helicopter lifted at 5:17. The storm had eased fractionally, enough for Rael to say it was manageable without being asked whether it was manageable. Victor sat with his hands on his knees and said nothing for the first 20 minutes of the flight, which was the first extended silence she'd been in with him, where the silence didn't feel strategic. At minute 23, he said, "The theory I was going to give you," before Petra interrupted, "about who's dismantling Graham's financials." She looked at him. "There's a woman," he said. "She's been tangential to every significant action in this situation for 15 years. She was the intermediary who brought the original partnership documentation to your father. She was on Beckett's contact list. I recognized the name when I first saw his files, before I understood the full shape of what he'd compiled." He paused. "She has access to legal infrastructure, financial networks, and the specific kind of institutional knowledge that would allow someone to move against 3 separate parties simultaneously without triggering any single tripwire." His voice was very even. "Her name is Ilara Cross." Seraphine went cold. "Cross," she said. "Vivian Cross's older sister," Victor said, "who has been operating in the background of this situation since before either of us was old enough to be involved in it." He held her gaze. "She's not missing, Seraphine. She sent her sister to deliver those documents. She staged the abandonment of the car, and the backup copies she arranged to be taken from the deposit box. She took them herself because she doesn't want the documents in multiple hands. She wants them in one place with one person at one moment." "She's been running this," Seraphine said. "Not running it, waiting," Victor said, "for the right convergence, for the moment when every player was in motion simultaneously, and the only way to stop it was for 2 people who'd been kept apart by everything she'd carefully maintained to finally be in the same room." The helicopter descended through the clearing storm toward the city below. "You and Graham," Victor said quietly. "That's what she's been waiting for." The city spread beneath them, lights in the pre-dawn dark, and somewhere in it a paralegal named Darian Moss was sitting in an office with a sealed envelope that couldn't be opened until both of them were present. And Seraphine thought about a woman she'd never met who had spent years arranging the conditions of this moment. And she thought about an attorney who had driven up a mountain road in the middle of the night and been found missing before dawn. And she thought about the last piece of the architecture, the piece she didn't have yet, waiting inside that envelope like a charge that had been set a long time ago and was finally close enough to the right moment to go off. The ground came up fast. She was out of the helicopter before the skids had fully settled, moving across the tarmac with the dawn breaking cold and pale over the eastern edge of the city. And her phone was in her hand, and Graham Holloway had 12 minutes before he reached the attorney's office, and whatever was in that envelope was about to detonate in both their hands simultaneously. She started to run. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had no distinguishing architectural ambition, glass and steel, and the anonymous functionality of a city that built things to be used rather than admired. Seraphine reached the lobby at 6:41 in the morning with rain still in her hair and mud on the hem of her coat and the specific physical exhaustion of someone who has been running on pure situational necessity for the last 8 hours and is only now beginning to feel what that costs. The security desk called up. Darian Moss answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. Graham was already there. She knew it before the elevator opened. His coat was hanging on the rack by the office entrance, still damp, and there was a paper cup of coffee on the reception desk that had been there long enough to stop steaming. Moss was a young man, mid-20s, with the slightly hollowed look of someone who'd spent the night in an office chair having periodic crises about whether he was doing the right thing. He stood when she came in and started to say something professional, and then apparently decided against it and simply pointed toward the inner office. She went in. Graham was standing at the window. Not sitting, standing, with his hands in his pockets and his back to the room, looking out at the city beginning to pale toward dawn in the east. He turned when she came through the door, and she saw his face in full light for the first time since the courthouse, which had been roughly a year ago in subjective time and roughly 22 hours in the actual world. He looked like a man who'd had everything taken apart in a single night and was still standing in the space where it used to be, not yet sure what to do with the emptiness. She probably looked worse. "You look terrible," he said. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He studied her face. "Are you hurt?" The question surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, but because Graham Holloway asking whether she was hurt was not a version of Graham she had much experience with, and it took her a moment to navigate around the unfamiliarity of it. "No," she said, "not physically." He nodded once, slowly, and turned back to the window. "I've been standing here for 20 minutes trying to decide which part of what you told me I'm angriest about." "And?" "Haven't decided yet. There's a lot of competition. He paused. My father. We don't have confirmation yet on his full involvement in what's happening to your business. That's part of what we need from the envelope. I know. His jaw was tight. I've known my father for 40 years. I don't need confirmation. I need documentation. He turned from the window. Where is he? I don't know, she said honestly. He left the estate after I did. He knows about the Marin Collective's timeline. He knows Lucien has been feeding them intelligence. I have his documentation on that, but I don't know where Victor Holloway is right now, and that bothers me. It should bother you. Graham crossed to the chair in front of the desk and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was the first time she'd ever seen him sit like that, without the performative ease that he usually carried in his body, the expensive suit posture. He sat like someone who was tired and didn't feel like pretending otherwise. Who is Alara Cross? I don't know yet. That's also what we need from the envelope. He looked at her steadily. Vivian Cross is missing. I know. Her sister engineered this entire night, and we're about to open a sealed document from a woman who may or may not be in a position to stand behind whatever's in it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said, which was the same word he'd said on the phone, carrying the same weight of things he wasn't saying. She went to the door and called for Moss. The young man came in with the envelope held in both hands, with the careful reverence of someone transporting something that has been designated important by people more powerful than him, and who has internalized that designation completely. He set it on the desk between them and stepped back. It was a standard legal envelope, sealed with red wax. Not theatrical wax, not decorative, just the functional seal of someone who wanted to ensure it hadn't been opened and resealed. Vivian Cross's initials were pressed into it. Seraphine looked at Graham. He looked at her. Together, she said. He broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a single handwritten page in a controlled, precise script that was different from anything Seraphine had seen in the materials Cross had delivered the night before. Older somehow, more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who'd composed this sentence by sentence over a long time rather than drafting it quickly. The second was a sealed legal instrument, notarized, with a federal registry stamp. Graham read the handwritten page first. Seraphine read it over his shoulder. The page was a confession. Not to a crime, exactly. Or not only to a crime. It was the confession of someone who had been present at the beginning of everything, who had watched the architecture of the last 3 decades being built from the inside, and who had spent those decades maintaining the single thread that she believed would eventually be capable of unraveling it. The author's name was at the bottom. Alara Cross, formerly Alara Beckett, Harlan Beckett's wife. Vivian Cross's older sister, who had taken her married name and then her maiden name back after her husband's death, and who had spent 11 years compiling the documentation that Harlan had died protecting, because Harlan had come to her 3 days before his cardiac event, his convenient 61-year-old marathon runner cardiac event, and told her the files were compromised and she needed to move them and finish what they'd started. She had been Aldrich Vale's legal counsel for 6 years in the early part of his leadership. She had been present when he'd received the report about Daniel Holloway. She had advised against what he'd done, and she had spent 30 years carrying the knowledge of what she'd failed to prevent, building toward the moment when the full truth could be put in the hands of people with both the standing and the motivation to act on it. The second document was the instrument she'd spent those 30 years building toward, a comprehensive legal filing, prepared in cooperation with 3 separate federal jurisdictions, detailing the full architecture of Victor Holloway's 30-year campaign, the murder of Daniel Holloway and its authorization by Aldrich Vale, the financial crimes, the engineered intelligence leaks, the identities of every intermediary, every payoff, every covered-up consequence. It was the kind of document that represented not weeks or months of work, but decades, layered, cross-referenced, airtight, in the specific way of something that has been reviewed by people who expected it to be challenged and built it to survive that challenge. At the bottom, in the margin, in the same controlled handwriting as the confession, the choice of what to do with this belongs to the people it was done to, not to me. Graham set the page down on the desk. The room was very quiet. Moss had retreated to the doorway and had the good sense to stay there. She gave us the weapon, Graham said. She gave us the choice, Seraphine said. He looked at the legal instrument, at the Federal Registry stamp, at the scope of what was documented in the pages beneath the cover sheet, which was substantial enough that it sat with physical weight on the desk between them. "My father," he said again. Different this time. Not a question, not an entry point into analysis, just two words carrying the particular grief of a man who has spent his life believing a thing about someone, and has just had that belief demolished so completely there isn't even rubble left to sort through. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She'd had her own version of that moment 3 hours ago in a hospital room, standing at the foot of a bed, watching her father close his eyes rather than answer her. She knew what the aftermath felt like, and she knew it didn't respond well to words. She picked up her phone. She called Patterson, Graham's contact, the man from the financial regulatory overlap, and when he answered, she said, "I have something that needs to reach the right people today. Not eventually. Today. Can you make that happen?" A pause. Then, "What are we talking about?" A full federal filing, multiple jurisdictions, 2 families, 30 years, documented completely. She looked at the instrument on the desk. Everything. Another pause, longer. "I'll need to make some calls." "Make them." She put the phone down. Graham was watching her. "You're turning it over," he said. "Yes." "Including what your father did." "Yes." She held his gaze. "If I protect him, I become what he became. Someone who decided that the cost of the truth was too high and chose the cover instead." She paused. "I've seen where that leads. I spent 6 years inside the consequences of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the window where the dawn had fully arrived. Pale gray light, the city settling into its daytime configurations, the ordinary machinery of the world resuming. "I'll testify," he said, "against whatever remains of his operation, whatever they need. That will cost you." "I know." He turned back from the window. "It already has." They sat with that for a moment. The confession on the desk between them. The instrument. The specific silence of 2 people who have arrived, from entirely different directions, at the same understanding about the same morning. "Where is she?" Graham asked. "Ilara Cross." Seraphine's phone buzzed before she could answer. A message from Emile, the first since she'd left the mountain property. 3 words. "She is here." She showed it to Graham. They took his car. He drove because she didn't have one, and because after a night of being in motion, helicopters, rain, corridors, confrontations, she found she wanted to sit in the passenger seat and watch the city past the window for 40 minutes without having to navigate anything. Graham drove the way he did most things, precisely, without wasted movement, with a competence so automatic it didn't require his full attention, which left room for the rest of him to exist in a different register entirely. He didn't talk much on the drive. She didn't require him to. Once, passing through the industrial outskirts where the road climbed toward the mountain approaches, he said, "I never asked you anything. In 6 years." She looked at the road ahead. "No," she said. "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "I knew there was something, not what, but I knew there was something I was choosing not to see." His hands were steady on the wheel. "That's worse, I think, than not knowing." "Yes," she said. "It is." "I'm sorry," he said. She thought about what those words cost him, not because he was incapable of apology. She wasn't certain of that. She'd never had the data. But because Graham Holloway had spent his life in the register of forward momentum, of the next acquisition, and the next project, and the next version of himself that was larger than the previous one. Apology required stopping. It required turning around and looking at what you'd passed. She didn't think he did that often. She didn't think he knew how to do it without it costing him significantly. "I know," she said, which wasn't forgiveness, which wasn't absolution, which was just the truth of having heard him, offered without decoration. He drove. Ilara Cross was in her father's study. She was 73 years old, older than Seraphine had somehow pictured, and she sat in the chair near the unlit fireplace with the composed stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific outcome for so long that the arrival of it doesn't produce agitation, only a kind of deep structural relief. She was not what Seraphine expected, which was probably appropriate, since almost nothing about the last 24 hours had been what she'd expected. She had close-cropped white hair and careful hands and eyes that had the quality of someone who had thought about the same things for a very long time and had arrived, eventually, at something like peace with what they'd found. Vivian was beside her. Alive! Seraphine let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she was holding. Vivian Cross looked tired and slightly shaken, but essentially intact, which meant the abandoned car had been exactly what Victor said it was. Staged. Misdirection to create a window. She'd been here since before dawn. Graham stopped in the doorway when he saw the two women. He looked at Elara Cross and she looked at him, and something passed between them that Seraphine didn't try to name. The specific, wordless transaction of two people who have been connected across decades by actions neither of them chose in our meeting for the first time in the aftermath. Mr. Holloway, Elara said. Ms. Cross. He came into the room and stood beside Seraphine. You knew my uncle. I knew Daniel, yes. Her voice was steady. He was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. She paused. So did you, both of you. Emile stood near the door. He'd arranged chairs, 4 of them, in a rough circle, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd understood that what was about to happen in this room needed to happen seated, at eye level, without the hierarchies that standing created. They sat. Elara Cross talked for an hour and 20 minutes. She told them everything. Not in the dramatic fashion of someone delivering a revelation, but in the patient, detailed manner of someone who has been carrying a very complete account of events for a very long time and is finally permitted to set it down in the correct place. She told them about the original partnership, Daniel Holloway's discovery, the meeting with Aldrich, what she'd said, and what he'd done anyway. She told them about Victor's reaction when he eventually learned the truth, about the 30 years of retaliation she'd watched unfold from a distance, about the moment she'd decided that the only way to end the cycle was to document it completely and wait for the convergence that would produce people with both the standing and the willingness to use the documentation correctly. She told them about watching Seraphine's marriage from a distance, about the specific, difficult decision to let it proceed once she'd confirmed Victor's plan. Not because she believed it was right, but because she'd understood that Seraphine inside the Holloway infrastructure, however the marriage had been arranged, would eventually produce exactly the moment they were currently in. Two people from opposite sides of a 30-year war, sitting in the same room, with the same need for the same truth. You used us too, Seraphine said. Yes, Elara said. She didn't qualify it. I used you as a mechanism for ending something that had consumed 2 families for 3 decades. I made a calculation about what the end would be worth against what the path would cost. She looked at Seraphine directly. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm telling you the truth of it because you deserve to have the full picture, not the version that makes me look better. The room was quiet. My sister has carried risk for this for years, Vivian said from her chair. Her voice was quieter than it had been the night before, smaller, more personal. The document we gave you, the federal instrument, building that has been Elara's life's work. Every connection, every source, every verified detail. She looked at her hands. Harlan died for those files. That's real. Whatever else is complicated about this, that's not. Graham looked at Elara. Victor Holloway. Where is he? I don't know precisely, Elara said, but I can tell you he won't run. Victor Holloway is not the kind of man who runs. She paused. He's the kind of man who decides when something is finished and accepts the judgment. He told me once, years ago, when we still spoke, that what he was doing had a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an end. He didn't want it to go on past the point where it had served its purpose. She folded her hands in her lap. I believe last night was that point. For him. She was right. Victor Holloway walked into the federal field office in the city at 9:47 that morning and asked to speak with the agent assigned to the Meridian Title Holdings investigation. He brought his own attorney and a hard drive containing 30 years of documentation, a parallel archive to Elara's, compiled from his side of the same 30 years, corroborating and expanding the federal instrument at every critical point. He waived his right to extended counsel deliberation and asked to make a full statement immediately. Seraphine learned this from Patterson at 11:15. She was sitting in the main hall of the estate, drinking the first cup of coffee she'd had in approximately 16 hours when her phone rang. She listened to Patterson deliver the summary in his careful, "This is unusual enough that I'm not sure how to present it" voice. And when he'd finished, she thanked him and put the phone down and sat with the information for a while. Graham was across the hall. He'd taken a call of his own 20 minutes ago. His attorney, she thought, or Marcus, and hadn't come back in yet. She could hear him through the half-open door, not the words, just the cadence. Contained, methodical, the voice of a man beginning the process of determining what comes next in practical terms. She thought about Victor Holloway walking into a federal building of his own volition. She thought about a 61-year-old man who ran 6 miles every morning and didn't come home. She thought about her father in the East Wing, who had known, and who had looked at her last night with the face of a man who'd been carrying the weight of a specific choice for a long time and was finally near the end of his capacity to carry it. She went to see him before noon. He was awake. The doctor had noted that he'd had a period of sustained clarity that morning, longer than the usual windows, and had left them alone after a brief assessment. Aldrich Vale was sitting up against the pillows when Seraphine came in. He looked diminished in the daylight, which the morning had brought gray and flat through the east windows. But his eyes were clear. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Section 7, she said finally. "Yes." His voice was thin but present. "I knew. Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at the window. His hands on the blanket were very still. "Because I didn't know when I made the decision whether you would choose to come back. And I needed you positioned somewhere I could." He stopped, started again. "I told myself it was strategy. For a long time I told myself that." A pause. "Your mother would have told me I was lying to myself. She usually knew." Seraphine thought about a woman she barely remembered, who had died when she was 4, whose absence had been the negative space around which this entire family had organized itself in ways nobody had ever directly addressed. "You let me spend 6 years inside a marriage that 2 separate men built as a trap," she said. "Yes. And you calculated that the strategic value outweighed what it would cost me." "Yes." He looked at her then, fully, directly, with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided he is done protecting himself from the consequences of his own decisions. "I was wrong. Not wrong about what it would produce. I see, looking at you now, that it produced exactly the person I hoped it would. But wrong about whether that entitled me to make the choice for you." He paused. "Wrong about whether any outcome justifies that." She sat with that. She'd been prepared to be angry. She was angry. It was there, solid and legitimate, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But she'd also spent the last 8 hours inside information that had systematically dismantled every simple version of every person involved in this situation, and what remained after that was too complex for clean anger to fully cover. "I've turned the documentation over," she said. "Everything, including what you did to Daniel Holloway." He closed his eyes. A long breath out. "Good," he said, "just that." "It will end the organization as it's been," she said. "Everything that operates in the current form will have to be restructured, legitimized or dissolved." "I know. I'm going to do that," she said. "If I lead this family through what comes next, it won't be the family it was. I need you to know that." He opened his eyes. "I know that too." He looked at her with an expression that contained grief and pride in approximately equal measure, combined in the specific way that only parents achieve when they are watching their children become something they always hoped for and never quite believed they'd see. "Seraphine." "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just a boundary. There were things she wasn't ready to process in this room, in this conversation, with this man who was her father and who had failed her, and who was dying and whom she loved in the difficult, complicated way you love people who are both of those things simultaneously. He closed his mouth. She sat with him for another 20 minutes. She didn't hold his hand and she didn't say anything else significant. She just sat there, in the chair beside the bed, while the morning light moved slowly across the floor, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone is simply remain in the room with them. When she left, she found Graham in the corridor. He was standing near the window at the end of the hall. The same window she'd looked out the night before when Vivian Cross's car had crossed the courtyard. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked in the morning light like a man who'd walked through something significant and was still in the process of understanding the terrain on the other side. "Your father?" she said. "I called him." He looked at the window. He didn't answer, which means he's either in a federal building or he's chosen not to. He paused. "Either way, I think I know who I'm dealing with now, which is more than I could say yesterday." She stood beside him at the window. Below, the estate grounds were quiet. The morning after, everything compressed and still. "What happens to your business?" she said. "Some of it survives. The parts that were built on solid ground." A pause. "The parts that were built on what he constructed, those I'll have to let go." He said it without drama, just the flat acknowledgement of a real cost. "It's a fair price for getting the accurate version of my own history." "It's a very high price." "Most accurate versions are." She looked at the grounds below. The iron gates, visible at the far end of the approach road, the trees that bordered the north wall, still moving in the remnant wind from last night's storm. "Lucienne," she said. "What happens to him?" "The council will hold a formal review. The documentation Marsh compiled is comprehensive. He'll be removed from any operational role permanently." She paused. "What the organization does with him beyond that depends on what the federal review requires. Some of what he fed to the Marin Collective may constitute criminal cooperation. That's for other people to determine now." Graham nodded slowly. "The Marin Collective itself? Victor's documentation on their operations goes to the relevant authorities along with everything else. What happens from there isn't something I can control." She paused. "That's been the hardest thing to accept. There's a lot of this that I set in motion and can't steer to the end." "That's true of most things worth doing," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the grounds below with his hands resting on the windowsill and his face carrying the particular expression of someone who is recalibrating in real time, not performing recalibration, actually doing it, which looked quieter and less certain and more genuine than the performance would have. "I kept thinking last night," he said, "about all the things I could have asked you in 6 years, simple things." He paused. "Where you were from, what you were afraid of, what you wanted." He looked at her. "I had 6 years and I never once asked." "I wouldn't have told you the full truth," she said honestly. "Not then." "I know." He held her gaze. "But I could have asked. That part was mine to do." He looked back at the window. "I've been very good at moving forward, at building and acquiring and progressing. I've been terrible at stopping to look at what was standing next to me." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way it could have been said without becoming something she didn't want to hear, just the flat, careful assessment of a man examining his own record. "I'm going to try to be less terrible at that." She said nothing for a moment. The grounds below were very still. The gates, the trees. "I'm not the person I was when we were married," she said. "I'm not going to be that person again." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." She wasn't sure exactly what he was asking. She wasn't sure he was asking anything. It was possible he was simply stating something true without an agenda, which was also a version of Graham she had limited experience with and needed time to assess. "We have a lot of wreckage to manage," she said. "Both of us, separately." "Yes. That's going to take a long time." "I know." She looked at the window for another moment, then she straightened and turned from it. "There's coffee in the kitchen," she said. "Emil made it properly, not whatever that was at the attorney's office." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the precondition of one. "That was terrible coffee." "It was," she agreed. She walked down the corridor. After a moment, she heard his footsteps behind her, unhurried, matching her pace. In the weeks that followed, the documentation reached the correct desks, and the correct desks acted on it. The process was not clean or fast or satisfying in the way stories sometimes suggest institutional justice can be. It was slow and bureaucratic and involved lawyers and jurisdictional arguments and the kind of procedural delay that made everything feel like it was moving through wet cement. There were setbacks. There were mornings when Seraphine sat with the legal updates and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has set a very large thing in motion and must now watch it move at the speed of institutions rather than the speed of intention. Victor Holloway's statement opened 3 separate federal investigations. His cooperation was extensive and, by the assessment of everyone involved, genuine. The cooperation of a man who had decided the time for the thing he'd spent his life on was finished and who had chosen, in the end, to be the one who ended it rather than the one who was ended by it. He did not escape consequence. No one in this architecture escaped consequence. But he faced what came with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago made his peace with the possibility of this outcome. Aldrich Vale's role in Daniel Holloway's death became part of the public record before the summer was out. The response inside the family was what Seraphine had expected and prepared for. Grief, anger, the difficult reckoning of people who had built their identities around a man and were now required to hold a more complicated version of him. She didn't try to manage their feelings about it. She managed the facts and let the feelings be what they were. Lucien cooperated with the review in exchange for terms that reduced but did not eliminate his legal exposure. He left the estate voluntarily in early autumn and did not return. Seraphine did not contact him. She thought about him sometimes, not often, but sometimes. With the complicated mixture of things she felt about anyone who had been genuinely close to her once and had turned out to be something other than what they'd appeared. That mixture didn't simplify over time. She stopped expecting it to. The transformation of the Vale organization's network was the work of the rest of that year and most of the next. It was not a clean process. Some operations dissolved completely. Others were restructured into legitimate enterprises. Security consulting, private logistics, international trade facilitation, operating in daylight with actual legal frameworks and actual accountability. Some of the people within the organization couldn't make that transition and left. Others surprised her. Petra stayed. Rice stayed. And his particular brand of honest, inconvenient integrity turned out to be exactly what the transition needed. Emile stayed until the end of the year, and when he retired, he did it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has lived long enough to see the thing they cared about become better than it was. Aldrich Vale died on a Tuesday in late November. He died with clarity, in the morning, with Seraphine in the chair beside the bed. He said 2 things to her in the last coherent hour, that he was sorry and that he was proud of her. She received both without deciding in the moment what to do with either one. That was work for later. For the long, unscheduled time after the acute emergency, when there was room to sit with things at the pace they actually deserved. She buried him on a cold, clear day with the mountains visible above the estate and the iron gates open, and the people who remained gathered in the courtyard without ceremony because he had always found ceremony hollow. She stood at the graveside with her hands at her sides and felt the full weight of everything. The grief that was real and uncomplicated, and the anger that was also real and also uncomplicated, and the strange, deep love that existed alongside both of them and refused to be canceled out by either. She had learned in the last year that things didn't cancel each other out. They coexisted. That was harder to live with than cancellation, but it was truer. Graham testified before a federal panel in February. He testified for 3 days comprehensively, and his account was corroborated at every critical point by Victor's documentation and Alara's instrument, and the financial records that Seraphine's team had helped reconstruct from the Meridian Tidal Holdings trail. He lost the development project permanently. Several of his companies required restructuring. 2 he chose to dissolve because the ground they'd been built on turned out to be his father's ground, not his. And building clean on top of contaminated soil wasn't something he was willing to do. He was rebuilding. More slowly than before. With less certainty about the outcome, which was something she noticed when they were occasionally in the same space, there was a quality to him now that hadn't been present in the 6 years she'd known him previously. A kind of deliberate attention to where he was and what was in front of him, as though he'd learned at significant cost that moving forward without looking at the present was how you ended up walking into a past you hadn't examined. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. In early spring, Alara Cross sent her a letter, handwritten, in the same controlled script as the confession. It was short, 3 paragraphs, and it did not ask for forgiveness because Alara Cross was not, apparently, the kind of woman who asked for things she didn't believe she was entitled to. It said that she was glad the documentation had been used correctly. It said that she thought of Vivian and of Harlan every day, and it said that she hoped, in whatever form the future took for Seraphine, that it contained things that belonged to her alone and not to the history she'd inherited. Seraphine read it twice. She put it in the drawer where she kept things she was still deciding how to feel about. On the morning in late spring, when the last of the operational restructuring was formally complete, when the legal frameworks were in place and the network had been remapped and the last legacy file had been closed or transferred, she went to the balcony off the main hall and stood in the early light and looked at the estate grounds below her. The gates were open. They'd been open since October, not because security had been abandoned, it hadn't, but because there was no longer anything here that needed to be hidden behind closed iron. What was here now was what it appeared to be, operating as what it claimed to operate as, accountable in the ways that accountable things are accountable. That was not everything. She was not so changed that she had become naive about what the world was and how it worked and what kinds of power persisted in it. But it was something genuinely different from what had been here before, and she had put it there. And it was hers in a way that nothing in her previous life had been fully hers. She heard footsteps on the stone below. Graham, crossing the courtyard. He'd arrived the night before on business connected to the last stages of the federal process, staying in the East Wing at Emil's former arrangement because there was room and because what existed between them now was too honest and too cautious and too genuinely careful to be reduced to a simple category. Not reconciliation, which would have required pretending the previous 6 years had a foundation worth returning to. Something else. Something that was being constructed slowly with the particular attention of two people who had both learned what the cost of inattention was. He stopped in the courtyard and looked up at the balcony. She looked down at him. He raised his coffee cup slightly. The universal language of people who are awake too early in the same place and have made their peace with it. She didn't smile. But something in her face shifted, and he saw it, and he looked back at the grounds with the expression of a man who has registered something small and decided it's enough for now. She turned and went inside. The estate was quiet around her. The corridors with their old paintings and their accumulated weight of time. The operations room, which now ran financial oversight instead of the other kind. The East Wing, where the doctor still came twice a week, even though there was no longer a patient to see. Habits of an institution recalibrating to a new purpose. She went to her office now, not her father's, hers, and sat at the desk and opened the first of the day's documents. Legal language, financial summaries, the ordinary vocabulary of a legitimate enterprise managing its ordinary concerns. She read. Outside, the spring morning continued without drama. The gates stayed open. The mountains were clear above the tree line. The kind of clarity that came after storms had passed through, and the air had been scoured clean of everything that had been building. Somewhere on the grounds below, Graham Holloway was drinking his coffee in someone else's courtyard and looking at a morning that was quiet enough, finally, to actually see. She was the woman who had ended a generational war without surrendering the part of herself that had always known it was wrong. She was the woman who had walked back into the burning house and made sure the right things survived it. She was not her father's instrument, or her husband's accessory, or Victor Holloway's long game, or Lara Cross's mechanism, or Lucian Vale's obstacle. She was Seraphine. That was, after everything, sufficient.